So we're in the Develop module in Lightroom, and we're going to take a little bit deeper dive. In our other video, we talked about the tone settings in Lightroom. Today, we're going to go into white balance and presence and kind of talk about what those can do to an image. So I have an image opened up here, and the white balance is not correct. It's very blue, and we'll probably see as we correct some of that blue out that there's a little bit of green in there. So I can choose a preset like our camera has settings. I can choose one of those and kind of get a pretty decent start on what I want to do with the image. So even just picking cloudy kind of brought it to the point where I want it to be. I might try shade. It's even a little bit more neutral. I think I'm going to want it just a touch warmer than this. And so now I can come down to my sliders and sort of adjust. And you can see if I go way over, it's going to be super warm. And if I go way to the other side, it's going to be super cool. So I'm going to find some balance kind of in between. And I think that that's a pretty decent balance. The other thing that I could do is I could grab this eyedropper and I could take it out and click on something like the clouds, and it'll neutralize the clouds. But when it neutralizes the clouds, it has to apply the same settings to the entire image. And that's going to very much warm up the rest of the image. So as much as I kind of like the clouds being neutral and gray, I don't like what it's done to the rest of the image. So I'm going to go back to my shade setting. I'm going to warm that up a little bit. And as I do that, as I suspected, there's quite a bit of green that's kind of coming out in the church building here. The facade of the church is showing just a little bit of a green cast. And so I'm going to take my tint slider and I'm going to slide it over a little bit and just take a little of that green out by adding some magenta in. And so now you can see that that front of the church has a little bit more of a neutral look, or at least less of a green look to it. And I think that looks pretty good for my white balance on there. I can go through and do all of my tone and exposure and highlight and shadow settings. I'm not going to worry about too many of those right now. What I'm going to show you next, and I'm going to zoom in to 100% on the church part of it, so that we can kind of see what's happening here, as I'm going to work with my presence sliders down here. So the first one I'm going to show you is clarity. And clarity is really just changing the contrast in the midtones. It's trying to leave the pure blacks and the pure whites alone and just work on the center of our histogram. And so you can see if I slide it over, it's going to increase the contrast in those midtones. And you can see that in our image. You can really kind of see that it's making highlights a little bit brighter and shadows a little bit darker. It's kind of trying to make the image more clear. If we slide it the other way, it's really going to soften that contrast out, and we start to lose a lot of detail that's in there. With the clarity slider, my advice to you is to use it very sparingly, is to kind of keep it as light as possible, because you can get that really kind of crunchy look to your images really fast. The texture slider right above it really could be called more of a smoothing slider. Its original intent was to be used for skin retouching and softening or smoothing skin out. So you can see if we slide it to the left, it'll really kind of do the same thing that clarity does, but not as intense, right? And if we slide it all to the right, it's very similar to what the clarity slider is doing, but it's not as intense. So we can even kind of call this texture kind of clarity light maybe. And so you can, slide it over and you can see that it's added, if I undo and redo that, it's added a little bit of texture into some of the facades on the buildings. There's also a dehaze, which if you have sort of a hazy, cloudy day, the dehaze will try to sort of break through that. Or if you wanted to add a little bit of a haze to it and kind of give it a little bit of a foggy, hazy look, you could slide it over and do that. Again, use that very sparingly and very carefully. I'm going to zoom back out for our vibrance and saturation sliders. So saturation is a slider that will amp up all the colors in your image or take all the color out of your image. So if I slide my saturation slider all the way to the right, it's going to really intensify all of the colors in my image. And if I slide it to the left, it's going to de-intensify all of the colors in my images or make them black and white. Vibrance is sort of a lighter version of saturation. And by lighter version of saturation, what I mean is it will affect the colors that aren't super saturated already. So it sort of favors the weaker colors in your image and makes them less weak. And so if I move that, you can see that it's doing a similar thing to what saturation does, but it's not making all of these sort of light reflections down here super saturated. I'm going to take the vibrance off and move my saturation up again. And you'll notice all down here in the street that those highlights got super orange, right? But when we do our vibrance move, those highlights, they get a little bit orange, but not quite as orange. And that's an extreme move, right? So I can kind of come back. You can see that vibrance really hits the sky a lot because the sky has some weaker colors in it. So it really wants to kind of amplify those. I can also go the other way and kind of take a little bit of color out. But you can see if I go all the way to minus 100 on it, there's still color in this image, but that's the more intense colors that are still there. All of the weaker colors are neutralized out. And so you can really kind of use vibrance to hit those parts of the image that just need a little bit of a boost and don't need it to be kind of overdone. So that's our white balance and our presence sliders. And I usually use those definitely in conjunction with our tone. So I would say that most of the time I would come in and do my tone adjustments first, possibly a white balance before that. But I noticed that as I change my tone sometimes, when you change tone or exposure or even contrast can also increase our saturation. And so much like everything that I've told you in Lightroom so far is that keep double checking or circling back every once in a while to make sure that everything still stays in balance and looks the way that you want it to look.